Well, hey, Cathy Lasher.
Hello. Yeah.
We're
Hello.
talking about coaching, and we're talking about coaching supervision today, particularly. We've had a conversation about this I found quite inspiring, and I found quite a lot of things in the things that we talked about that I think should be out there, and I wanted to share that with other people. So I suggested that we do this, and you kindly agreed.
I
And I
did.
look forward to having a conversation with you again, this time in a little bit longer.
Okay, well, that sounds great, Yannick, and thank you very much for asking me to do it. Sort of hoping that I remember whatever those really interesting things were that I said the other day. It seems like the world is moving on very quickly from minute to minute, and kind of every day we know more than we knew yesterday. That's always been true, but it feels really profoundly true right now.
Mhm.
So whatever I thought last week when we had that conversation may not be the same as what I think right now anyway. So I look forward to talking with you about it.
Yeah, me too. And it's good that it's not fresh in your mind, because that means you say it with the same gusto and passion once more, which is great.
Okay, good. Let's see what happens.
Yeah. Well,
Mm.
you've been in the industry for quite a long time. I've seen you had your own personal development business since almost 30 years. You've
Yeah.
been coaching for a number of years. You've been a supervisor for a long time. You
Hmm.
teach at Metanoia. You've done some work with Barefoot Center for Coaching.
Yep.
And I don't know. You've been around. I wonder if there's anything that would be useful for anybody who's listening to this conversation to kind of know about you, to kind
Mm.
of paint a bit of a perspective of where you're coming from.
Okay. Well, how I think about my perspective and where I'm coming from is, well, first of all, one of the things most people ask me about is, are you American? I say, yeah, I am. And despite the strength of my accent, I've lived in the UK for nearly 40 years. And I sound like I just got here today, but as we know, there's no planes flying at the moment. So that couldn't actually be happening. But I think that's important because, I started my career in America. And I think the way in which coaching has developed in America and the way coaching developed in the UK were quite different. How I understand it is that coaching developed in America as a kind of alternative to psychotherapy in a way, that people thought psychotherapy takes too long. We could do coaching that would kind of get us there a bit faster. And then as that happened, people started to realize that actually that was useful in their lives and that they could take that into the workplace. In the UK and other parts of the world, coaching developed quite the other way around. It was a sort of performance management approach. It started more in the sort of business world and then moved forward then from the business world into the sort of personal. So they kind of crossed over each other. And I think that's really important in terms of my perspective, because I do have these two different pillars to my work, as you kind of alluded to, which is they're parallel to each other. They're two symmetrical pillars. One is a coaching pillar and one's a psychotherapy pillar. And with each one, I have my own clients, my coaching clients, my psychotherapy clients. I have people that I supervise, my supervisees, both the coaches and psychotherapists. And I offer teaching and training for people who either are or want to become coaches in this pillar or psychotherapists in this. And the two pillars are quite parallel to each other. And there's a bit of crossover. But I think the thing that really holds those two pillars together and holds them upright is a passionate interest in reflective practice. And that interest in reflective practice is the thing that I think is common to the two and provides a sort of cross-fertilization between those two approaches. And maybe in a way, that's where the supervision comes in.
Mhm.
So,
Before we go
yeah.
there, as I heard you speak, it seemed like coaching and psychotherapy, they seemed like quite independent pillars with some overlap in between.
Mm-hmm.
But like you talk about them as quite distinct. And I wonder, and this is something I've been
Yeah.
interested in for years, I often
Yeah.
ask people,
Mm.
how would you describe or
Oh.
formulate the difference between the two, given that they seem quite distinct to you, you know?
Well, I think they're distinct to me in the way that I practice the two things. I don't think conceptually everyone would agree that these are distinctions to make between the two sort of practices. But I think for me, in the coaching, there's much more focus on a moving forward, on a setting and achieving goals, on a kind of appreciation of what's gone before, a kind of recognition of past memory insofar as it can serve us going forward and creating the kind of future, present and future that we want. Mm-hmm. But the past is kind of only interesting in how it informs the present and the future, perhaps, in coaching. Whereas I think in psychotherapy, there's a kind of deeper understanding and appreciation for the past and not so much emphasis on the moving forward and the goal setting. That happens, and we're interested in that in the present and the future, but it's kind of maybe not quite so much the focus, the future focus and the goal setting in the psychotherapy. I think in a practical way, there's also a big difference, because I think in psychotherapy, it's very important to keep the process as contained as possible, which generally means weekly, at the same time, in the same kind of place, same sort of process each time, so that the whole body mind becomes susceptible to the process and kind of ready for it, ripening for it each week at the same time. Whereas in coaching, I think we bring a lot more of our, well, depending on which models you're looking at, much more of our adult or rational or cognitive selves to it, not ignoring the other things, not ignoring the rest of the whole body, mind, and holistic person, but maybe with a slightly lesser focus. And so we can be a little less rigid, perhaps, about the container for the process. Does that make sense?
Yeah, well, that makes sense to me. I think every practitioner has their own kind of way of describing it. I love how you use the word ripening. You know, that it creates some lovely imagery.
Yes.
And I like that a lot.
I love the idea of ripening, actually, because partly because, yeah, it does create good imagery, but I think it's such a great word, because the process of ripening can be interfered with either positively or negatively, but it can't actually be forced with the same effect as a natural ripening.
I think that with the same effect is key here, because as it happens, you know, we've been buying some avocados, given the current pandemic. You know, we've been buying some that are brick hard.
Yes.
And they need some extra ripening. So I've been looking up how we can actually do that, because there was a day where we ate all of the good ones within like 2 days. And then we wanted to eat another one, but like, what do you do when you have one that's
put it in a bag with a banana?
Yeah, and you can do a bunch of stuff, but like you can accelerate the ripening process in that sense, but it's a different outcome and result.
I think so.
I think that's a really good metaphor for like coaching and therapy. Generally, there aren't any shortcuts. Some things you can accelerate. The outcome will always be different. And then it's a question that I would like to put to the client usually. You know, what kind of results are you looking for? Because if you spend more time with something, obviously the result is going to be a little bit different.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly that. Yeah. It's interesting thinking about the metaphor of food in relation to all of this, because, you know, I think about people's personal development journeys and the kind of nourishment that comes from personal development journeys and the kind of sense of satisfaction, which for me is not that different from the sort of satisfaction and nourishment that you can get from good eating. But I think that's probably a topic for another day.
I was thinking, and also some people, they devour moldy stuff.
Yuck.
Anyway, lots of things, but like I'd love to move on to kind of supervision, because I'm really passionate about this right now, not just because that's how we initially connected, but generally because for a couple of years, since I kind of fell into doing more and more supervision. And then I realized coaches really need that.
Yeah.
And particularly right now, in times where I see a lot of coaches, so much good stuff came out of coaches in the last couple of weeks. I'm blown away by just the amount of service, the good-hearted, great valued people putting stuff out there that could help people, which also included a lot of free offerings for coaching in times of crisis, or coaching for emotional support, people affected by COVID-19. And the supervisor in me was like, oh my God, we're going to be so busy. I mean, I hope we're going to be so busy, because there's going to be so many coaches out there who deal with tremendous amounts of anxiety, uncertainty, endings, extreme forms of endings, like people losing loved ones, and if we put out free offers, then it's only a matter of time or a matter of numbers that, some coaches with very little training in psychotherapy or counseling or holding a space of emotional depth, they will be sitting there with clients that might completely overwhelm them, or perhaps just slightly overwhelm them. Or there's clients who are existing coaching clients who want to, use the coaching time to come to terms with something that might go a lot deeper. A lot of stuff might get triggered for clients, and coaches will need to navigate. And in this sense, it's probably amazing that we just talked about the differences between coaching and therapy. But I think clients will move over and cross traditional boundaries of what the coaching space is for. And I think this is why supervision is so relevant right now. And I really, really hope that more coaches would, use it. And having said all of that, I don't have a specific question. I just wonder how you would respond to that.
Yeah, well, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, I've also been very struck by the generosity of offer that has been made by thousands, literally hundreds of thousands of people. But if we're talking specifically about coaches, the coaching offer and offering free sessions, offering additional service in some way to try and, I liked your concept of, working at emotional depth, holding that deep emotional space for people. And I have some concern about it, partly for the reasons that you've mentioned, which is that I think that it's very easy to become overwhelmed, to end up in territory that's really unfamiliar, and to feel, well, like you're drowning, really. And I as a supervisor, I mean, maybe it's useful to say that I think that as a supervisor, we have responsibilities to the coaches we supervise. And we have other responsibilities as well, I think. We have responsibilities to the coaches' coachees, the sort of people that the coaches were working with as supervisees, the people they're working with. We have responsibilities to them to make sure that they're actually getting served well by the coaches that are working with them. And I think we have responsibility to the coaching profession as a whole to make sure that we're kind of supporting really good practice, good professional practice that keeps the profession, such as it is a profession, in good repute and good standing, and that people recognize it for the fantastic service that it can be when it's done well. And so when you talk about, when people are giving these generous offers of support, I think about those coaches who are offering it and the sort of support that they might need, as you've described. But also think about the people they're working with. Like, how will those people feel held enough by the coaches if the coach is there on their own? There's some kind of, maybe it's a bit of a crazy psychological phenomenon, but when a coach is in supervision, the supervisor somehow is there in the session with the coach and the coachee. Even if you're not physically present, you're somehow there in the coach's awareness that they know they have somebody they can kind of lean back on. They know they can talk to somebody later about the event. They know they've maybe talked to somebody before the coaching session. So they're kind of feeling like they're doing the best coaching they can and being the best coach they can be.
Yeah, I had a recent supervisee share with me that in a recent session, they got kind of stuck on something and it was really difficult. And all of a sudden he's like, Well, and then it came to me, and I asked myself, what would Yannick do? What would Yannick ask me right now?
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
You know,
yeah.
oh yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, he would probably ask me some question, and then I would remember that I just need to relax and trust the process. And I'm like, I'm not sure if I want to take so much responsibility here.
No, but I
But
think that's brilliant, because
yeah.
actually I think that is one of the biggest benefits of having regular supervision
Mhm.
is the development of what I call the internal supervisor. I mean, I
Mhm.
didn't make that term up, but it's that internal supervisor that a coach can develop, that can go with them to every single session.
Mhm.
And yes, okay, your supervisee thought that that was your voice, and you may have taught him that, but he had that inside himself. That was available to
Yeah.
him there in that session. How fabulous for him and for his coachee
Yeah,
that
I
he
think so
had that
too.
there.
Generally,
Yeah.
I really appreciated that. Just
Mm.
sometimes there in a supervisor whom they call Yannick says some really strange things also, and I'm like, oh, now that Yannick takes on a life of his own.
But Yannick, maybe that's a reason for it to be a bit of a relief that it's actually
Uh-huh.
his version of you rather than you there
Yeah, he
doing
doesn't know
that.
that yet, though.
Oh, well,
Fair play.
yeah,
We're working on it.
yeah, good
I think it's
idea.
generally a really good thing that people have
Mhm.
that person to lean on, you know, and that
Yeah,
gives them a bit of confidence
yes,
in that moment
yeah.
to trust the process or whatever other the rules they come up or rules, guidelines, you know,
Mhm.
mantras they
Yeah,
come up with for their own coaching practice.
that's right.
Um,
Yeah, it's good.
I think that brings me to another question. The kind of, because in the beginning when I got into supervision, I was so careful not to teach anything. You know,
Oh,
I kind of approached supervision as I started to approach coaching in the very beginning.
okay.
Very facilitative, never giving any advice. You
Uh-huh.
know, always putting the responsibility with the client, you know, and assuming that they have their own right answers. So
Uh-huh.
I came into supervision with that kind of attitude. And then I remember there was a day in my training where I was like, oh my God, there's a formative element to this work. There is a teaching, mentoring element to this
Yeah,
work.
yeah.
I always thought I would have to call it something different then, but you know, then I
Uh-huh.
realized almost every supervisor has some of that, which
Yes.
I didn't quite know how to feel about in the beginning. And
Okay.
I still I embrace that kind of element to my work, but I felt I had to call it something differently in order to put that mentoring or training hat on every now and then. For me, that then became rocket supervision, as in like integrating all of these different professional hats. When I
Okay.
when I do something that I would call more traditional supervision, I would not have that kind of teaching element in there, other than, you know, sharing quite genuinely and challenging them on what their kind of norms are. Normative, sorry, not formative. Um,
Right.
so I
Okay.
just wanted to put that out there because, yeah.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I am having delivered quite a lot of supervision training to coaches who are training to become supervisors
Mhm.
themselves. I think that's not uncommon, what you describe. I think that
Mhm.
we've challenged ourselves through our coaching training and through becoming coaches. I don't mean just doing coaching, but really
Yeah.
becoming coaches, to trust the other has their own
Mhm.
answers, to recognize the value in good, strong, probing questions, to recognize the preciousness of just careful listening.
Mhm.
That when we move into training as supervisors, it can be quite difficult to say, well, actually, you can use some of those muscles again. You know, you can have some of those skills back again. And I think you're right that every supervisor will find their own way of blending the different skills that are required to be a good supervisor. But I suppose I want to kind of hark back to what I was saying earlier about the responsibility being not just to the coach who's being supervised, but to their
Mhm.
underlying clients and to the profession as a whole. And I think that I'd like to maybe put a bit of a developmental lens over the whole picture and think about where coaches might be in their developmental process. And that's not just about how long they've been coaching, but it may also be about what kind of other challenges they're dealing with in the moment. So for example, in the case that you're talking about now, where people are delivering a lot of services, maybe generously, to people who are in the midst of traumatic experiences and crisis, those kind of almost vicarious trauma connections can actually send people to earlier stages in their own development, for example. And therefore they might need something different from their supervision than they would need if they were coaching somebody on I don't know, some other kind of personal or professional development goal that they're quite used to. So I think if you can think about developmental lens in a kind of very wide-ranging way, I would say that as people increase in their amount of development, they need less teaching. But that at earlier stages in the development, they need more. And I would say it's both formative and normative. You kind of use both of those words, and I think, change them around a little bit as you were talking. I think both.
I meant normative.
Well, I think formative as well. I mean, I think they're both true, because I think we need to help our supervisees form themselves as coaches, and maybe we have tools, techniques, ideas, theories that would be helpful to them. Why wouldn't we share them?
And I think that speaks to both, right? Because I mean, for those people who don't know what we're talking about, the normative element of supervision means we're upholding certain norms. These are the kind of things in the industry, because we have a responsibility towards the profession of supervision, of the profession of coaching. There's certain ways that you do coaching. That's the kind of norms that come in. For example, if we both practice underneath, let's say, the IC or within the ICF framework, then there would be certain elements of the coaching work that we would feel obliged to point out if a coach is not in line with that.
Yes, and actually it's interesting, because I think, I absolutely agree with what you're saying, and I would extend it actually to, the sort of ethics of the profession as a whole, or the practices of the profession as a whole. It may be that there are norms within a coach's organization that, if they're working for an employer, that maybe need to be upheld as well, making sure all the paperwork is done the way it needs to be done, for example, that kind of thing.
And that's often something that the coach is not, many coaches I've worked with, they're not really, like their allegiance is with the client. And where they're getting paid by the organization. I was shocked by the amount of coaches who say, I care about my client. It's like, but there's a second client here, the person who pays your bills.
Quite. Some people would even say that's the first client.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, this is the interesting part, because I would imply that there's a norm, that, if there is a three-way contract between client, organization, and yourself, that you have equal responsibilities towards them. But that's my view of what coaching is. And so I'm always very careful with that kind of normative aspect of the supervision, because I think ethics is a series of questions you ask yourself, and then you need to you consistently ask them constantly. And then you need to create your own framework of what's right and wrong. You need to form yourself as a practitioner and create your own norms within that coaching practice that you develop. But I know there's a lot of organizations, professional bodies, and supervisors out there who say, no, that's not what you do as a good coach. And I'm here to point that out to you so that you can learn and develop as a practitioner. And
well, now it's almost becoming formative. If you're the normative is to, as you, I think, is how I see it, is pretty much in line with what you're saying, which is that there are norms that exist in the profession and in our society generally, and they need to be adhered to, and but it's up to each coach how they do that. Would I choose to work with somebody who sort of saw it really differently than me? I don't know. Maybe not. We'd have some good, strong, potent conversations first, but at some point I might decide that I don't want to be, I'm either going to be influenced by that, and perhaps I'll be changed by it as well. Or maybe we need to go our separate ways. I'm not sure. But when
Yeah,
you
if you spend too much time in conflict with your supervisor, you know, it goes beyond what's actually
excuse me, I'm
constructive.
going to cough.
Yeah, please do.
The other thing I should say is that at the moment, you know, when anybody coughs, it's like, oh my God, they're coughing.
Oh, yeah.
But
I feel safe behind my screen.
good. I've had this cough a very, very long time, like nearly 40 years.
Oh.
Note the connection between when I moved to the UK and when I got the cough.
Uh-huh.
Ugh.
I have some hay fever during this time of the year, and sneezing is also kind of pretty frowned upon these days.
Yeah, it's not quite settled. I'm hoping it will settle. I'm sorry about that. It's disruptive to the recording.
I almost drank out of an empty coffee cup as well.
Do you need to get something?
No, I'm good. Do you need to get something?
No, I think I've got enough for now to just. Sometimes when it catches, it can take a little while to kind of really settle down. So I'm hoping it will.
I remember I did the first time I had like somebody from a leadership coaching kind of collective invited me to do a little test session with her. And I was really psyched because, you know, I was really excited about the opportunity. I was just kind of coming up in my coaching journey. And then I did a really good job, I think, coaching her. And as soon as it was over, I had such a cough and I couldn't stop.
Oh, no. No. That's terrible. Anyway, I'd spend, as you can imagine, I spend a lot of my time talking, teaching, delivering, you know, all that. And sometimes the coughing really gets in the way. It's very, very annoying. So I was just about to be referred after about 2 years of lobbying my GP and jumping through a gazillion hoops, was just about to be referred to the Manchester Cough Clinic, where they're doing some trials on the vagal nerve, which I think is what the problem is that I've got, is that there's a damage, sort of post-viral damage to the vagal nerve, this part, which means that there's a kind of weird sensitivity in the back of my throat that sometimes feels like I've inhaled sand, and that's and that's what happens, and that's what gives me the impulse to cough. And they're doing some research on it there, and because it's an out of area referral, it's taken me years, literally 2 or 3 years, to try and get my GP to, and I jumped through all these hoops, and I was just about there, and then COVID, and I'll never get there now. But
yeah, everything that happens in the throat right now is going to be booked out for a little while.
Yeah, I think so. Anyway, I think I'm all right now, so sorry about that.
Yeah, I mean, we've been talking about norms, and like, I mean, maybe as an existentialist and always having been a bit of a rebel, and, you know, part of that probably got me so attracted to the coaching profession. I've always liked it that you can be your own practitioner and that there isn't any regulation. And I've been asking I've been asking myself the question, given that I've seen some really horrendous coaches out there practicing what I would call extremely unethically, whether we do need some regulation. And I guess that's a question for both coaching and for supervision, because coaching supervisors are also completely unregulated. Everybody could just call himself one. So I wonder what you think about regulation. I mean, obviously you're probably going to be influenced by the therapy background that you have, but
which is also pretty much not regulated.
Yeah, well, in the UK. That was so shocking for me to hear.
Yeah, I don't know. I'm very, very, very ambivalent about the whole thing, because my personal philosophy, I don't believe in it. I believe in self-regulation. I believe that I believe in kind of positive principles and ethics and integrity and positive growth and all of that, and sort of generosity of spirit and purity of the soul. And I mean, you know, I could kind of go on from there. But I think that, you know, when it's working, that's great. But I actually think that the process of allowing those people who are doing it badly to kind of end up shooting themselves in the foot and leaving the field is a bit too slow. And I think that people can get hurt.
Yeah.
I don't know what the answer is, because I think regulations also hurt people. I think they exclude people. I think they are never fair. You know, there's always an inequity in regulation. However hard anybody tries to put equity into regulation, it's very difficult to regulate. So I don't know what the answer is. I'm glad that that's a thing I'm not in charge of, by the way. But what I am in charge of is myself, and regulating myself, and making sure that I'm ethically practicing, and that I am doing things to the best of my ability, and that I'm getting help and support where I feel I need it, where I think I need it. And actually, the coaches that I end up working with, you know, as their supervisor, I think they feel the same thing. They think about it the same kind of way. They want to be sure that they are being the best coaches they can be, and serving the profession as well as they can be in that work. And I don't know, does like just attract like? I don't know. But I haven't really worked with many coaches where I felt that, I suppose, anything that would have been regulated had it been a regulated profession isn't how I wanted it to be. It's very, very rarely that has happened. I've seen it, but it's more like over there. They don't come to supervision. So,
yeah, I guess.
Yeah, I don't know. It's a tough one.
That brings me to my next question. I mean, we could talk about this for a while, but what you just triggered, there's a lot of coaches who I think would do really well with working with a supervisor. Maybe that's my kind of value judgment, or like my kind of framework, but I would wish there would be more coaches in supervision, and particularly the ones who will not work with a supervisor are probably the ones, I don't want to say who need it most, but you know, who would, I don't know how else to frame it. I think you know what I mean.
I think I do.
How can we get those coaches? How can we reach those coaches? I don't want to say convince, because, you know, everybody else has to make their own decisions, but I do care about the coaching profession. And there's a lot of people who do give the life coaches a bad rep, particularly because there's no regulation, and there's a bunch of cowboys and cowgirls out there who are doing horrendous stuff just because they can sell really well. I'd love to reach those people and say, hey, being in supervision, it's going to be really good for you. It's going to be good for your clients. It's going to be good for everybody, because you're going to learn a lot, and, you know, you're going to be able to question some of the stuff that you do, perhaps not because I think it's wrong, but because I think it's good to question. And I think there's a lot of people out there who don't want to question. Maybe they know on some level that what they're doing is maybe not so kosher, but like, I don't know, there's so many people who don't even consider going to supervision. And I fell out, like I got blocked on Facebook once by a super high profile coach, because I was very lovingly question why that person thinks that they don't need a supervisor. And that was, I had that again and again with coaches telling me I don't need supervision, when I think it's just maintaining best practice and, you know, good ethical standards. So I wonder what we can put out there to have people realize what the real value is here.
I think that's a really tricky question. I mean, it's a great question. It reminds me a little bit of, you know, what we have been saying for years about the people who are very self-aware. There's a sort of inverse relationship between people who believe that they're self-aware and people who are self-aware. You know, the more you can say, oh yeah, I really know myself well, the less likely you are to actually know yourself well. And I think it's a little bit like that with the coaching and the supervision. So but I actually think there's a more fundamental problem. I think it's something to do with the history of supervision in the coaching profession. The very language of the word, you know, the very meaning of the word supervisor, it's not helpful.
Well, not the meaning of it, more the connotations that people have in the association with it, as an overseer in like a prison or something.
Yeah.
Not as supervision.
Or as a, that's right. or as a, you know, a kind of in a line management way, somebody is supervising.
Yeah.
You know, I'm
Yeah.
thinking
Yeah.
about like people who work on the line in a factory or something like
Yeah.
that, the supervisor, who kind of basically is there with their clipboard, making sure that everything's happening, you know, exactly as it should be happening, and you're
Yeah.
working hard enough and producing enough widgets and so forth. And I think the connotations of the word and how it's interpreted are really unhelpful. And I think having a different word for it would have been a good idea. But of course, we've taken it in the coaching world from the psychotherapy and other helping professions world, where clinical supervision has been a kind of a hybrid maybe between that kind of supervision we've just been talking about of a foreman or an overseer, with a kind of helping other who might help you to understand your workload and kind of manage your cases more powerfully than, or more better than you are at the moment. And I guess taking the word from those other helping professions means that we're kind of stuck with some of the connotations that have come from there as well. You know, I'm thinking back to what you said earlier in the conversation about when you started out as a supervisor, you wanted to stay with a sort of coaching approach to supervision, and it was only with a bit of reluctance. I think you didn't use quite that word, but that was my sense of it. You know, the bit of reluctance that you started to add a bit of teaching or a bit more direction in relation to, say, coaching norms. And I don't know what the word is that can be used to explain it, but I guess the question I would ask is, how can you be sure that you are being the best coach you can be if you never check out your work in a rigorous way? And I think we know from a lot of the science on reflective practice that an intrapersonal reflection is powerful. That spending time by yourself, thinking about what you've been doing, thinking about what you are going to be doing, asking yourself questions about what you've learned, what you've done well, what you could do better, what you can leverage in terms of strengths, is a powerful thing to do. But by itself, it's not sufficient. It really needs to be combined with a bit of interpersonal reflection between people. Because we know from the science that when people reflect on their own, they often don't finish their sentences. They make assumptions about connections between points that don't get made fully explicit. Same kind of science that supports the value of coaching, actually. Yeah. So if you believe in coaching for your clients, why would you not believe in interpersonal reflection for your own work, for the quality of your work? And I think that is, I mean, whether you could get anybody to engage with the question or not, I don't know. But I think that's the question.
Yeah. Well, I think it depends on who we're talking to, right? We always need to think about who are we reaching. And the person I've had in mind just now, very connected to what we just talked about. Like, they wouldn't want to be, the reasoning behind not working with a supervisor is because they see a supervisor as the kind of supervisor who can teach you stuff, because they feel there's an amazing coach and there's nobody who could teach them, you know.
Well, that's fine.
But in that sense, it's not helpful to have that supervisor understanding of what coaching, what supervision is. You know, in the beginning, I think reluctance is the wrong word, because I did a lot of teaching as well, I still do, and I know about the value of sometimes putting the training or the mentoring hat on in supervision. But if it's needed and wanted by the client, you know, and it's important. If somebody is has 20 more years experience as a coach in, let's say, working with line managers in the insurance industry in a specific company, I can't teach them anything about that, most likely, but I can put my coaching supervisor hat on, my formative hat, and allow them to grow as a practitioner by having exactly that conversation that you described. You know, so in that sense, a skilled supervisor, just as a skilled coach, will be able to switch between different hats and roles
Mm.
And I've done some research on that to actually look at what are the different roles that I have. How many coaches have I worked with in supervision that said, I'm holding myself back all the time to not give any advice, when actually instinctively they know that that would be the most helpful bit for the client right now. And they've had like maybe 30, 40 years of a teaching background, and they know the company and the position inside out, but they feel forced and restricted by the coaching framework that either they have imposed on themselves, or the coaching training had imposed on themselves, or a previous supervisor had imposed on them.
Mm-hmm.
And it's such a liberating feeling when a coach realizes that they can make their own rules,
Mm.
and they can form their own norms.
When
And
I first discovered that there were no coaching police who came into every session with me, I was free. It was great. It was great. Yes, I think you're right about the influences, the previous coaching supervisor, the coaching training, I think is really important in that respect. And but actually, if you were sort of deviating a little bit away from the idea of the supervision point, but I think the other thing to, and maybe I'll stop myself there, because maybe the other thing to say is that that point that you just made about allowing yourself to go with your instinct or intuition, and actually even a thought through sense of what would be most helpful for the client in that situation, is a good example of the sort of thing that can be done in supervision, which isn't about making a correction. It's about thinking about what coaches are already really good at and how could they leverage that even more effectively and more powerfully for the service of themselves and their clients. So I think maybe that's the other thing, is that if somebody says, I really have nothing more to learn about coaching, that doesn't demonstrate much of a coaching mindset, as if it was a finite amount that could ever be learned. That how can that be? So if somebody is saying, I've learned everything there is to learn, then how does that connect? How does that resonate with a coaching mindset? And that means something very different than what I think of when I think of coaching.
Yeah.
I would really want to challenge that.
I would really want to work with that person, but they
Wow.
wouldn't let me.
I guess I'm not surprised.
Yeah. Yeah.
Mm.
Well, that feels like a good end of that part. I think we said a lot, and I think it's quite useful. Can you think of maybe that's quite a coaching question. Can you think of a good question that we should ask ourselves right now?
Well, you said something before about why supervision is really important right now.
Mm-hmm.
And we talked about that to some extent. I guess the next question would be, if somebody wanted to access supervision, how would they go about it?
Oh, that's a good question.
If we convinced them,
Mm-hmm.
by
Maybe
this.
before that, how would you describe, because I think I had that somewhere in the beginning, I wanted to ask it, and then we got into the flow of things, but how would you describe supervision? Let's say to somebody at a dinner party who knows about coaching, or perhaps somebody who's just starting out as a coach. So in the easiest, simple to understand way, what is coaching supervision?
Well, coaching supervision is, excuse me, I'll start that again.
Mm-hmm.
Coaching supervision is a way of having a particular kind of conversation about your coaching practice, about some combination of these, your individual clients, the interventions you make with individual clients, your overall practice, things you're concerned about or interested in about the way you're coaching, the profession as a whole, any of those things. It's a way of having an interesting conversation about that with a person or people who know something about those things. So every coaching supervisor will have a slightly different way of doing supervision. But for me, how I think about it is that the point of it is to help you as the coach to become even more competent and even more autonomous than you are already. So depending on how competent and how autonomous you are or feel, the whole idea would be to help support you to move further along both of those continuums through a lot of things you'd recognize that look like coaching, listening to you, asking you questions, but also by telling you some things, by sharing some of the supervisor's own experience, my experience in this case, or some of the theory around coaching that, to whatever extent you know, it would be helpful to you to build more competence and more autonomy.
Great. Yeah, and to kind of allow for, you just triggered something there, because sometimes I describe supervision as coaching that's focused on your professional practice. And I think it allows to the kind of freedom that we just described that a supervisor or a coach has to kind of form their own approach.
Yeah.
Because as some supervisors are more facilitative, others will be more directive.
Correct.
And so I think it's quite useful to think about it in that way, because it allows the person who hears it to make sense of supervision in the way that they make sense of coaching. You know?
Yeah.
I would invite them to look beyond what they think coaching and supervision is. And then they just need to ask their supervisor, how would people go about that? I think that's really useful and practical thing. The first thing that came to my mind was to ask around, you know, ask your colleagues about their supervisor. Because I think it kind of like does two things. One is you get a personal recommendation and you strike up a conversation about supervision, but also you show that you want to, you know, work with a supervisor, and you probably, like, other people will realize that, you know, people are looking for this kind of thing. So I think by people asking you about your supervisor, I don't want to shame anybody by not working with a supervisor, but asking, when I was not working with a supervisor, I was terrified of somebody asking me,
who's your supervisor? Yeah, exactly.
I would need to admit, no, this was before I became a supervisor. But like, I was like, oh my God, I hope nobody asks me about like whether I'm in supervision, because I would have to say, no, I'm not currently in supervision. And I really felt that it was important.
So why weren't you?
Money back then.
All right. Okay.
It was just something that was difficult to afford. And I think that's a real issue for coaches who are struggling to make ends meet in the first place with their coaching.
I agree, but I also and I also think that it's really a false economy. I mean, so many, I'm very flexible about my charging structure for supervision, but even if I weren't, I think I believe this really strongly, that helping the coach to develop a thriving coaching practice is part of the job of the supervision relationship. So
well, that's a bit controversial.
I know, but I really think it can be, if it's worked out between the two of you, a shared investment in helping to build the coach's practice. And if a coach comes to supervision saying that their practice is not as rewarding financially as they want it to be, that is definitely part of the supervision agenda. And many coaches whom I've supervised have seen their practices increase hugely, not because of anything I've done, but through the use of focusing on their coaching practice in the way that you described. But I also think that even infrequent supervision is a good idea. So even if you can only afford it once or twice a year, it's a good idea to have supervision, even if you can only do it once or twice a year. It's much better if you can do it more regularly, more frequently, you know, but if you can't, don't not do it. Just go to one or two. And make sure you get what you want out of the supervision. So negotiate with your supervisor. Tell them what you want out of the supervision. Make sure that's what you're getting.
Yeah.
Mm.
Yeah, and a group supervision as well.
Yeah.
There's lots of supervisors who offer groups,
Yeah.
and generally, whenever you hear somebody speak about their relationship with a client or their coaching practice, you can't help but reflect on yours as well.
That's right.
And I mean, sitting in the spotlight, or I mean, in my supervision groups, there's up to 4 people because I didn't want more. So everybody gets to share at least once every 2 months. There's cost-effective ways to get that.
Yeah.
Lots of coaching schools offer reduced supervision. I make supervision for coaches in training available at like 2/3 of the price. I think it's important that people are there. The overlap there is an interesting question, because what I found is, especially with the supervision groups, I had some that started off as more traditional supervision groups, which was what the initial package was meant for the coaches still in training. It was meant to get people to work with a supervisor to look at their coaching practice. Obviously, that includes you as a person, because you cannot, separate the coaching practice from the coach. But then that rocket supervision element, that business mentoring element, for example, how can you get clients in the room in the first place so that we get something to talk about?
Yeah.
Then I put my kind of mentoring training hat on for a little bit, and we looked at how do you run a consultation, for example. How can you talk about money in a way that is confident and you actually believe in it. There's so many things that you can learn that will get you clients, and then the clients get good value. But then I realized more and more we only did that, and we didn't really talk about what you're going to do with clients. So to get the balance right was really important, and that needs good contracting, I think. Because it's easy to feel like, oh, actually today with my client has been going well, but I have this client that I want to sign up, and they came to a consultation, and it's like, I think we're spending a little bit too much time getting clients in the room, and you're actually maybe not looking at, because some of the best supervision sessions, both with clients and myself with my supervisor, I've had when I didn't know what to bring into the room. And we just looked at the last session, and all of this stuff was there that I didn't realize made a difference. And I learned so much from looking at a session that I thought was going really well. So I like my clients where we agree very clearly that this is not going to be business coaching, and it's not going to have that element. You need to bring something that happened with a client or in its wider context into the room. And I like that. But again, in rocket supervision, I like the flexibility of being able to go into different areas.
I'm wondering, as I listen to you describe it, if maybe one of the reasons that happened was because of some homogeneity in the group, that they were all at the similar stages in their building their practice. Did you say they were all coaches in training?
But it's both group and one-to-one. And yes, it does definitely have to do something with where they are in their development.
I think it's great that you challenged people to say, in a way, you didn't quite use these words, but how I might have framed it would be something like, is there something we're avoiding here by talking about the business development bits and not talking about the coaching bits? Maybe there's something that's being avoided. Is there something?
Maybe it's just more important.
Maybe it is. Maybe it is. And I guess over some period of time, I would be more allowing of it, and then eventually I would be questioning. I generally invite people to prepare for supervision by thinking both about their client work and about themes or practice development issues, and to kind of do all of that preparation, and then only then to decide what it is they actually want to bring to the supervision. Now, some people don't do that in a very formal way. Other people do that in a very formal way. I'm indifferent between those approaches. It's fine, however you want to do it. And at least then I feel that there's been a little bit of intrapersonal, just going back to what I was saying before, intrapersonal reflection on the whole gamut. Whatever we end up talking about. I mean, I think there's a way in which the business development piece can be thought about in relation to individual clients as well. And I'm very, very keen to make sure we're not just talking about deficits, that we're also talking about things that are going well. And, you know, if you got that client in, how did you do that? And what could you learn from that you can bring into this next bit and so forth.
Yeah.
But
that's
yeah,
the whole positive psychology ethos, you know, that we work with strength and resources that are already there, and how can you utilize them more, build on it.
Exactly. So
what went well with your last client, you know, is a question that many people don't ask.
No, that's right. Yeah, that's right. So yeah, I think what I'm really noticing as I'm listening to you is, you know, I think we don't know each other all that well, but it seems that we have a lot of beliefs and philosophical ideas as well as practices in common with each other, and yet we also have some things that we're very different about. And I think that's one of the beauties of this profession, really, is that maybe this is partly because it's not regulated, I don't know, but maybe it's more because just it's done by individual people. And it means that we're not copies of each other. There isn't just one way of doing it. There's a personality infused, characterological way of doing these things, both coaching, which all the people listening to this will recognize because they're their own coaches, but also as supervisors. And then when you take those, you know, individual supervisors with the individual coaches and you match them, every relationship is also going to be different, unique, and it's really, I find it really exciting. It sounds a bit twee, but it really feels very exciting.
Yeah, and that ties into the question you've been asking very importantly. How would somebody go about finding a supervisor? Well, think about how you would go about finding a coach. You would probably ask a few people. You'd probably, maybe you would Google and look at a few websites. Maybe you would have a couple of conversations. Maybe you would read some articles somewhere. Maybe you go to the supervision school that you trust and look at who's supervising there. Or, you know, you read a book on supervision and look at who some of the authors were, whose voices you liked, whose values you seem to approve of. You know, so have some conversations. You know, most supervisors, just as coaches, will also offer you a conversation that they won't charge you for, to kind of see how the chemistry is like and get to know each other a little bit before you make a decision.
Yeah, exactly. So, sounds good.
Any directory of supervisors that you would rate particularly, or?
There's a new one, isn't there? Well, relatively new. What's it called? What's it called, Yannick? Do you know what I mean? There's a new one.
Don't think so. I know the ICF has a directory. The EMCC also has a directory. I'm not. The
this is a separate.
probably has one.
Yes, maybe it's no. It's It's separate to all of the coaching organizations. It's specifically like an association of coaching supervisors. I don't know. I'm sorry. I don't know. You'll have to edit this.
We'll put it in the show notes.
yeah, exactly.
Cool. Well, I have a couple of questions that you can answer as shortly or lengthily as you like.
Okay.
We do have 20 minutes left. I want to give you some time to get into your next meeting. But I think there's a few things that it might like bring out some cool stories or just be of like nice value. And I try to ask them the people that I do these kind of conversations with.
Okay.
First one would be, okay.
I feel like I'm bracing myself for whatever this interesting question is going to be.
Feel free to say next.
Okay.
What are 1 to 3 coaching books or books generally that have had a significant impact on your work as a coach or supervisor or generally?
Yeah. The first coaching book I read was the Coactive Coaching book from the Coaches Training Institute in America. And in fact, that's where I did my initial coach training, was with the Coaches Training Institute. I was living here at the time. This was in the 1990s. And I was living here, but I read about this and I thought it sounded so very interesting. And I think at the time I thought I had already been doing coaching, but just by a different kind of name. I didn't know that it was called that. And I went over to the States and did the training, and I just thought it was great. And I loved their ideas. Two of the ideas really stuck with me. One was the co-created relationship in coaching, which has become kind of just a fundamental truth, I think, in coaching now, but it seemed new to me at the time, that there wasn't the power relationship that often exists when somebody goes to another person for some help and pays them for it, just didn't quite exist in the same way in a coaching relationship. The coach might be the expert at listening and asking questions, but the client was the expert on their own life and their own circumstances. And that just felt really beautiful. And the second concept that really stuck with me was the dancing in the moment. I just love the expression and staying in the here and now of the dancing in the moment, being fleet of foot enough to respond, knowing some steps, but also just feeling the music. And I'm reminded, my partner is originally from Blackpool, and well, until this year, every year we went up to Blackpool to just for a little nostalgic visit. It's a pretty horrible part of the country in many ways. But one of the things that's wonderful about it is the Blackpool Tower Ballroom. And they still have this really old Wurlitzer, that organ that plays live music. And people come from all over to dance there in the afternoon on a Saturday. And it's just magnificent to watch the people dancing on the ballroom floor. And it always makes me think about coaching and dancing in the moment. And when I'm coaching, I'm always thinking about the Blackpool Tower Ballroom and seeing these people elegantly moving around the floor. And they're all doing the same steps, but it's very personal. And I just love that. So that is one of the books that definitely really influenced me.
Just to inject very quickly, because
Yeah.
it reminds me of, I think it was Peter Hawkins who wrote in one of the books, one of the coaching question he proposes is, if you and your client were in a dance together, what dance would it be? And that, together with a metaphor of supervision as somebody who's dancing with you on stage, but also at the same time is on the balcony watching you dance.
Yeah, very good.
As an overseeing the dance of the,
Yeah.
dancing, great metaphor.
It is. It's great. And I don't know about you, but I am not a great dancer, but I love the feeling of dancing with a great partner. It's just amazing. So anyway, yeah, thank you for that. Thank you for sharing that. I suppose the other person that I'm thinking about who really influenced my thinking about coaching and indeed about supervision was Michael Carroll. I think having come from maybe from a psychotherapeutic background, I already resonated a bit with him and his thinking. But his concept of a learning partnership in supervision, I think, is really hugely important. And the idea that the supervisee needs to take as much responsibility for what comes out of the supervision relationship as the supervisor, and that it's something about working together and asserting your own needs as the supervisee. And I guess maybe that fits with my idea of autonomy and competence, that I'd be really encouraging the supervisee to think hard and carefully about what it is they want out of supervision and how they can best get that from me, or somebody else if it's not going to be me. I think probably, there's many, many, many more, but those two really probably stick out in terms of early formative things for me.
Well, that just extended my question from books or people. Because it was books and now I added people to my question. So I'm going to ask that question differently going forward. Thank you for that.
All right. Okay. Sorry.
No, not at all.
Okay.
Are there any trends that you see in the coaching industry or in supervision, or anything, any movements or anything that is right now happening or you predict coming up in the near future?
Well, there's the obvious move to online working.
Well, that's very much happening.
Which is happening. without a huge amount of preparation for it.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. It's always, I've always found it very difficult to predict how things are moving. And I think my whole career has kind of developed in a sort of an opportunistic way. I think I do what I like to do and seem to find ways to make that viable financially and emotionally and so forth. And I guess I kind of think that well, it has served me well. But I do think that I do think that in terms of the coaching profession, you know, we talked earlier about regulation. I don't know what's going to happen with regulation, but I think that certainly the market kind of is clearing itself out a little bit. I mean, I think it got really crowded. I think maybe the financial pressures that people are going to be in as a result of this worldwide pandemic may change the face, not just of coaching, but of the whole business world. So I think it's really hard to predict. You know, if we'd spoken 2 or 3 months ago, I think I might have said something about organizations moving towards a place, more and more organizations moving to a place where actually providing external coaches as a specific explicit offer is becoming less and less prevalent, because actually there are more and more organizations where a coaching way of being is becoming more of how they do things, like having a coach as opposed to just being in coach style, moving away from command and control as a management style and moving more and more into coaching style of management. That seemed to be a way that many organizations were moving. Certainly a lot of organizations that I've been involved with over the years have sort of reduced their reliance on external coaches. So I think there's been a move in that direction. I think there's an increasing trend in terms of hiring external coaches in organizations to require that they're in supervision.
Yeah.
You know, I certainly have been asked way more times in the last 2 years than I was ever asked before, just to confirm that I am in active supervision.
Or even accredited.
And or accredited. Yeah, absolutely. Yes, that's a good point, actually. Accredited as a coach.
Yeah.
Not even whether I have qualifications as a supervisor. Yeah.
Yeah, and I hadn't been asked up until about 2 years ago. I had never been asked for any accreditation.
No, me neither.
Certainly in organizations that happens more and more often now.
Yeah, that's true. I hadn't thought about that, but that is true. I guess that's an easy enough way for organizations to feel that they can distinguish between
tick the box of
tick
quality.
the box quality, but it is just a tick the box, isn't it?
Well, you do have to. I think there is a difference between somebody who invests into the ICF application, because it is a couple of grand, depending on which route you go.
That's
true.
You
do have to send in a video, and they're a lot more strict about who they let pass than I had thought. I thought it was kind of a tick box exercise, but then some very distinguished coaches that I know, two that I think of specifically, told me they failed the ICF. It was a master coach. So master coach, maybe they're a little bit more, I don't want to say draconian, but like after it. But like I've talked to a few people in the ICF, and they're very quite strict about holding.
I think there are only 50 ICF master coaches in the UK.
Oh, less, I think. One of my students did some research, and like that was 2-3 years ago. It was, I think, 32 or 34.
Yeah, I think it's 50 now. I think it's about 50 MCCs, master coaches, and about 500 PCCs, and quite a lot of ACCs. Yeah. I don't know how many.
Yeah. Well, that certainly is a thing, and I don't know. We could have a long conversation about the ICF. Maybe we have it another time.
Yeah.
But we sort of touched on it in terms of their competency frameworks. My wife is a Lacanian psychoanalyst by training, and
Okay.
she has that particular look on her face when I talk about competencies and frameworks.
Okay.
So, she's very critical about these kind of things, which I am too. But I think generally it's a good thing to have somebody trying to unite what coaching can be and
I think
trying to
so.
say, this is what coaching is, and here are some quality assurances that a client who has no idea what they're getting themselves into can actually say, oh, here is a stamp of approval that
Yeah.
I can trust to some degree.
And I guess it's a kind of flag in the sand, at least, that you can say, well, I'm a bit more like that as a coach, or I'm a bit more in that direction as a coach, but this is the basic thing that I'm kind of describing myself in relation to. You know, you were talking earlier about directive versus facilitative in relation to supervising. I think the same thing could be said of coaches, actually. So we have a kind of standard that the client sets the agenda and the client sets the direction. But after you've had that, you could be a bit more directive, or you could be a bit less directive.
Yeah, it's like getting your driving license. After you've got it, there's not really anybody holding you to account other than the occasional police controller. If you don't break red lights, then you can almost drive any way you want. If you don't
Really?
cause
I didn't
damage.
know that.
Well, we do have the unrestricted motorways like in Germany. But, no, I mean, for example, maybe should I admit to this? Like, if it's the middle of the night and there's a stop sign, and I've learned in school that, you know, the head needs to nod.
Oh,
So you
right.
come to a full
Okay.
stop at a stop sign. And
Okay.
if I come reasonably slow and I don't need to bring my car to a full stop to have everybody be completely safe. So I may or may not have occasionally done that in my days driving.
In some places in America, on the stop signs, it says full stop, no charge, rolling stop, $300 fine.
Yeah. And sometimes, I mean, yeah, well, that's again, it's another
Story,
conversation.
yeah.
But yeah, I think it's generally useful to have the guidance, and it's incredibly complicated how you bring in a competency framework without restricting the beauty that is an unregulated profession.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah,
So,
that's a lovely way of putting it, Yannick.
Without breaking confidentiality, tell me about your most memorable client. And this might be a coach in supervision, but could also be a coaching client.
Cool. My most memorable client.
Or a memorable client.
Yeah. Well, I think this may not be memorable for the right reasons, but one of my most memorable supervision clients was a coach who told me that he'd been working with somebody who disclosed to him that they had forged a will.
Oh, wow.
And he didn't know what to do. And I guess, like many experienced coaches, quite a lot of what gets brought to supervision is in the realms of what I would consider to be ethical dilemmas, where there are two or more ethical principles in tension with each other, and you have to decide which one you're going to go with and feel comfortable with the outcome. So we worked through a kind of framework for ethical decision making, thinking about different ethical principles that might be at play. I mean, the most obvious ones were, I suppose, to do with the confidentiality for the client, but also to some extent self-care and self-respect for the coach himself in terms of his own values and what he believed was the right thing to do, sort of ethical integrity. And we worked through an ethical framework, and in the end, he made a decision that he was happy to live with, and I supported him in that. But it took us some time to come to a decision. One of the interesting things about it was that he was conflicted in particular because he agreed with his client that actually it was a more equitable outcome to have forged the will than it would have been to have left the will standing as it had been before.
Wow.
And what he was worried about was that he only believed that because he'd only heard the coachee's side of the story.
Yeah.
And I think it brings up for me this idea that we never really know what the coachee is talking about. Mm-hmm. That they have their own view of the world and their own interpretation and their own perspective. And actually, that's the wonder of coaching, is that they are the expert on themselves and their lives. And actually, we can never really know. And we have to, as coaches, make whatever decisions we make. Now, this was one step removed because I was supervising this coach, but that has always stayed with me as a way of thinking about, if I'm ever tempted as a coach to think I know what the coachee should do, I'm reminded that we only know it through the eyes of the coachee and not in any really real way. And I remember that story.
Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah, thank you for asking. Thank you for asking.
I have a last one, which this one I warned you about. So perhaps
right.
you've had a little bit of time to think about it as we were having this conversation. Maybe it left your mind completely.
It did, actually.
If you
could now.
Yeah, if you could take over the screen of any person or group, including the whole world or all the coaches or just one person or a selected few, and you have their undivided attention for about a minute, what would you tell them? Or what would you show on the screen?
Gosh, it's such an important opportunity. I hate to waste it with something I haven't thought about a lot. I think I'd say, be more respectful. Respect others more. Respect yourself more. Imagine that everybody is doing the best they can in all the circumstances in which they find themselves. Assume best intentions. Be careful. And I don't mean just cautious, I mean full of care. Remember that we're visitors on this planet, and take care of it and each other. And listen to me!
Excellent, that will stick.
Right. Yeah.
Cathy, thank you so much.
Yannick, thank you.
Where can people find your work, or are there any projects you want to tell people about?
I'm so just down a hole at the moment, Yannick. Honestly, I'm just under the cosh of things and projects. I don't quite want to advertise anything yet. My next project that I'm about to get involved with is another book on reflective practice from the psychotherapy world point of view. But it's not, I'm not very advanced with it yet. And in the current state, I'm just kind of thinking, oh, I'm just trying to keep my head above water, I think, at the moment. So,
do you have a website for your supervision services? Just in case somebody is like, oh, I really like Cathy, I really connect with her.
cathylasher.co.uk.
Cool. That's I put that in the show notes as well. If you want to send me anything else, just let me know and I'll put it underneath the YouTube video or wherever this way.
I suppose I really should provide a link to my book, Better Thinking for Better Results, the reflective practice.
Yes, and you should get Cathy's book. I'm sure you will learn a lot.
Yeah. Exactly. Very practical book to work through. Don't buy the Kindle version. You need the hard copy so you can write in it.
Huh, excellent. That's good to know.
Okay. Thank
Cathy,
you.
thank you so
It's been a
much.
pleasure.
I'm sure we'll speak again.
I hope so.
It was a real joy.
Yeah, it was great. Thank you very much for the chance to talk about supervision. It's been really interesting. Loved it. Thank you. Take good care. Bye for now.
Bye.
Hello, my name is Melanie, and I am Yannick's intern and video editor. If you'd like to find out more or join the conversation, you can go to his YouTube channel, or you can go to Facebook. Just search Talking About Coaching. Thank you for watching, and speak to you next time.